Okay, great. Good afternoon. This is Caradina Sale with the McSilver Institute, along with the Community Technical Assistance Center, CTAC, and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, MCTAC. And I'd really like to welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is called An Introduction to Adaptive Leadership Concepts for Organizational Change by Dr. Linda LaSalle Bryant. Dr. Bryant is with the Silver School of Social Work here at New York University, where we also work. And before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to our WebEx system. Just so you know, I'm sure many of you have been on before, but just as a reminder, everyone's placed on mute to avoid any background noises that might distract yourself or others. And if you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to our host, Foong, who will be able to assist you. So you'll have a little chat down for CTAC host, and you can chat there if you have any issues. Your chat box is to the right. If you don't see it, at the bottom of your screen is a blue kind of thought bubble that you can click, and that will help you to bring up your chat box. We will be using our chat box feature a few times during today's webinar, including in 1 second, because we'd really like to know who is with us today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the presentation today, but I'd like for you all to chat to us what your role is in your organization. Today's presentation is a really important one for leaders of groups, programs, leaders of organizations, or even leaders of agencies. Dr. LaSalle Bryant has many, many years of social service work, and as well as many years of experience as a leader. I will let her introduce herself in more detail, but please chat in your role if you can over to the right so we know who's with us today. And in full disclosure, I just want to say that Dr. LaSalle Bryant taught a class that I was in recently, and during the presentation it occurred to me how amazing what she was saying is, and how it would be really be wonderful for our CTAC audience and MCTAC audience to hear from her. So I was so grateful when she said that she would be able to participate. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Dr. LaSalle Bryant, in a second. But before, I just wanted to say we have a care coordinator with us. We have a director of care management agency. We have an executive director of Alcohol and Drug Council of Tompkins County with us. We have a grant writer who's also a leader in their organization, an anti-racist initiative. Wonderful. A new supervisor we have with us. We have a coordinated, wow, everybody's chatting in. Thank you, everyone. This is wonderful. Your new supervisor at Salvation Army, director, clinical director of Rockaway, pros for Catholic Charities. We have an administrator. We have a director of research. So I'm sorry, not everyone can see chats, but so I'm just going to read them all out. I'm sorry that you're not able to see them. Managing director, data analyst, and another administrator. So we have a whole variety of leaders here with us today, Dr. LaSalle Bryant. I think we can go ahead and get started, and you can introduce yourself and then get started with our webinar. Thank you so much again for being with us.
Thanks a lot, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to see the range of people we have joining us today. And I'll just say a couple of words about my professional background. I think you all have the bio, but basically what I want to say to you is this work comes out of a 30-year career in human services, and I'm particularly passionate about building the capacities of leaders in the human services arena. And one of the questions we're going to be examining today is whether our leadership models as they currently exist are really a fit for the challenges that we face in human services. So I'm going to ask you to keep an open mind, really keep an open mind, because my goal today is to challenge some of our thinking around what leadership is and what it requires from us. My last role before I joined the faculty of NYU Silver School of Social Work was as the executive director of a nonprofit child welfare agency. And I did that for 9 years. Most of my career has been in youth services, children and youth services, with one 3-year stint in New York City government as an associate commissioner for the New York City Administration for Children's Services. So the child welfare arena is one that can be particularly challenging, and one in which we work closely with mental health and other healthcare providers. So I'm bringing some of these experiences in those roles to this presentation, and I'm hoping today to really spark more questions in you rather than provide answers. So as I said, keep an open mind. Okay, I'm having my first challenge with moving the page. Okay, so our agenda today is we're going to examine the concept of leadership. What is it? What do we mean by adaptive leadership? And why is adaptive leadership so important, particularly in our sector? We're going to examine the differences between authority and leadership, discuss some of those challenges that occur in the workplace, and conclude with some of the qualities of adaptive leaders. And then we'll have time for Q&A. Oh, all right, sorry about that, guys. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to ask us to do is to clear our lens, our filters around what is leadership. So I'm going to ask you to, how do you define leadership? And if you would take a moment, chat in your chat box right now, your concise definition of leadership.
Okay, we have a few people chatting in. We have supporting others to achieve a common goal.
Mm-hmm.
Supporting, motivating, role modeling. Providing feedback, guidance, and directives, as well as being ready to assist and do the work yourself. Mm-hmm. Guiding others to achieve a goal. Supporting staff, the facilitator of learning and development. Mm-hmm. And we have achieving an agency's mission by navigating, wow, a lot of people are chatting in all of a sudden, by navigating through challenges and helping to set and reset priorities. So helping to support the mission. Fostering the success of my team and program through feedback, guidance, supporting, and developing their strengths. Thank you, everyone. This is amazing. Thank you so much for all of your chatting. Capacity building is another one.
Yeah. Oh, I love this. I see the art. Someone put the art. Mm-hmm.
The art of being an example setter for individuals who look for you for guidance and support. Yeah, that's wonderful. And providing direction and guidance to move organizational goals forward and build staff capacity and skill. And here's a final one, knowledge about the mission, willingness to do the work, and the ability to strategically plan to improve.
These are excellent answers, and it's pretty clear that we have leaders who are on this webinar right now. Especially, I think some of the key themes here are this idea of role modeling, right? Of not asking people to do something that you yourself are not willing to do, and how important that is. So everything that you have contributed in terms of these answers are definitely traits and characteristics of good leadership. And we often know that because we have experienced leadership. We not only provide it, but we also experience it. And I imagine that some of you have experienced what you consider to be great leadership and not so great leadership. So I want to offer you a definition of leadership in the adaptive leadership framework. And I just want you to take a minute, take it in, and we'll talk about your reactions. So let's try this on. Leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. The authors of the Adaptive Leadership Framework, Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky, who come out of the Harvard Kennedy School, this is the definition that they offer of leadership. And when I first saw this, I thought, what the heck are they talking about? Of all of the ideas you provided in the chat box, disappointment was not one of them. So I'm curious about your reactions to this definition of leadership as disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. Why and in what way would this be connected to leadership? If a couple of you have some ideas, you can just put it in the chat box now, and then I'll begin to unpack this notion.
Okay, we have some people saying this is accurate because you won't please everybody all the time. Somebody else is saying people are disappointed with change and they can only change at a certain rate, so they need to manage that change. So it seems to be really resonating.
Yes, yes. And I think we have to give a gold star to these answers because that's exactly right. The reason why Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky use this definition is because they suggest that leadership really is about advancing needed change. And that change is particularly difficult and challenging for people and will lead to some disappointment because it's asking people to do something that they may not feel comfortable doing, ready to do. They may have to relinquish things that are familiar and known, and that's going to create a challenge. So all of the things that you mentioned in your definitions of leadership, supporting, role modeling, these are all competency, skills, traits that are particularly important in leadership. But we want you to conceptualize leadership now as managing, sparking change in an organization, in your organization, sparking change that is necessary, that is needed. As the adage says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But when you know that something really does need to be changed, how do we mobilize people to do the hard work of making change? So let's look at what leadership is and isn't with that definition in the backdrop. Now, I'm going to imagine that you have probably known or experienced people who were in leadership positions. They had the role, they had the title, they may have had the corner office, but you wouldn't say that they were effective leaders. So first thing we want to do is distinguish leadership from the position or role of the leader. It doesn't matter what the title is, what the role is. That's not what makes a leader. Leadership is activity. It is something that you do. It's not a position that you occupy. People who have the positions can fail to exercise leadership, and as I said, I know if we were to poll all of us, we'd probably all be able to name at least one person who was in a leadership position but did not exercise leadership. We also know people who are nowhere near the top of the org chart, and yet they are people who we would have no problem saying that they're leaders. So what we typically refer to as leadership, the person in the position, what that really is the person who has authority. The person who is labeled the boss, the director, the CEO, there's authority in that role. So they have a role of authority. And in an ideal world, what we want is for that person to also, in addition to having authority, we want them to be able to exercise leadership. So this graphic here, this picture, illustrates the traditional notions we have about leadership. You see the big red leader there, and everyone else is following, and the leader is pointing the way. And that can work. That can work just fine, assuming that the leader knows where they're going, has the destination correct, and that everyone is on board and willing to go along and follow. So it works until this happens, right? What if that big leader really doesn't know where we should be going and can potentially lead the team right off the cliff? So the more complex the situation, the more risk there is for this to happen. So in the adaptive leadership framework, we're looking at what kind of leadership is required in times of rapid change, where there are real consequential changes, but the times are uncertain, and the challenge is of a level where there are no easy or clear answers, okay? So let's think about our sector in human services. I feel like this is our arena. There are no clear or easy answers. This is not, gee, I have strep throat, let me give you an antibiotic, and in a few days it will be cleared up. What adaptive leaders have to do is identify and deal with systemic change. And that's going to require using techniques and approaches that are going to confront the status quo so that we can confront the fact that change is actually needed. And it also means being able to distinguish between what problems or challenges we have in the organization in which there is a technical solution, and what that means is there's an answer that exists somewhere in the world to that challenge. It may be a complicated challenge. For example, if you ever get the blue screen on your computer, that can be a technically difficult and challenging problem, but somebody, some IT person knows what to do about that, even if we don't. So that means that the information does exist. The answer exists. But then there are more complicated issues like, how do we deal with racism in the workplace? Well, that's not a simple answer like, well, let's take 2 anti-racist workshops and call me in the morning and everything will be fine. Those are much more complex situations where there are no easy answers. And I'm just going to encourage you, as you're taking this in, I just want to encourage you to jot down any reflections or questions you have. So we'll have an opportunity in a little bit to review that. How many of you remember this? Now, this may have some people date themselves, but this was a very, very popular device, the Sony Walkman or the Sony Discman. You might recall that they were everywhere. Everywhere you walked, you would see someone with this attached to their hip or their waist, and it's a music listening device. And the reason why I share this example is that Sony Music Company was the maker of this device, and because this was so popular, it helped propel Sony to a real place of prominence as a business. But all businesses, all organizations must be able to change and adapt to their current landscape. Those that don't usually will not survive. So I want to ask you a question. I want you to take a guess at what percentage of Fortune 500 companies that were around in the 1950s are still around today. If you were going to guess on a percentage, how many do you think are still around today?
Okay, we have 30%, 10%, 15%, 40%, 20%, 50%, 9%, 5%, 60%. So a big variation that people are guessing. Big
variation in the percentage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
So the answer is actually about 13%. So that tells us something about the imperative of adaptation, how important it is for organizations to be able to adapt to changes in their environment, and how connected that is to whether the organization thrives or not. Now, Sony had this pivotal moment in their history in which digital music was coming on the scene, and they had to decide if they were going to go in the direction of digital music or whether they were going to hedge their bets on the popularity of the Discman and the Walkman. And as you may recall, they stuck with the Discman and the Walkman. and the rest is history, right? So digital music came on the scene, took over. We don't see people wearing these devices anymore. And Sony has certainly recovered as a business, but not quite to the level of prominence that they were in these days. Okay, so I say all that to emphasize the imperative of adaptation. So what it means for an organization to adapt, the work that they have to do to adapt is first identifying what practices or systems are working and need to be preserved. Right? So what's working in your organization right now? Are your techniques, your practices, your meeting structures, your organizational structure, what parts of that are working and should continue to exist because they're working? Then you identify what's not working. What are some practices that need to be discarded? Maybe there's a Monday morning meeting that's been happening for the last 15 years, but that isn't a particularly productive meeting. It happens out of tradition, out of routine, right? That's just one example. But what other practices may not be working? Maybe everybody's still charting on paper files, and maybe that's actually slowing things down. I don't know. I'm just raising that as an example because it'll vary by organization. But the challenge here is the wisdom to know the difference. What do we need to keep? What do we need to get rid of? And when we make that assessment, that means we're going to have to learn some new practices and approaches. And here's where we get into the arena of discomfort. When you're asking people to change behavior that is normative, that's tradition, that is routine, that is comfortable, that's going to throw people into a state of disequilibrium. That's going to throw people into a state of discomfort. And our job as leaders is to accompany them through that loss, that feeling and that period of loss, and make sure that it's at a rate that they can stand. If it's too much change too fast, people may shut down. They may leave the organization. They may become demoralized. If the rate of change is too slow, then the risk is that nothing changes at all. We just, pretend like we're working on change, but we pretty much keep doing the same things. So we need to titrate the pressure. We need to find just the right degree of pressure to mobilize people to change, but not freak them out. Right? So it's really about balancing that pressure and mobilizing people to change. So earlier I referenced authority, and I want to just distinguish how we look at authority versus leadership. And a really important point I want to make is that I'm not saying that authority is bad and leadership is good. Authority is necessary for a civil and organized society and for an organization to run efficiently and effectively, but leadership is also needed for that organization to thrive. So both of these things are needed, but what we want to do right now is uncouple these ideas because they often get conflated. We often assume that the person who occupies the role or position is exercising leadership, and they may or may not be. So authority has to do with the role or position. And the role of authority is to provide protection, direction, and order. And again, this is critically important. I saw in the chat box that someone on the call, there was a fire drill going on in their organization. And if a fire were to break out in one of your organizations, you can best be sure people are going to want protection, direction, and order, right? You don't want to go to the person and say, what do we do? And they're like, I don't know. You want someone who says, this is what we're going to do. Everyone's going to take this exit. Don't take the elevator. That is a crucial function of authority. People need to know, what time do we need to come in? What time are things expected to be turned in? What's my compensation going to be? We need authority in organizations. But leadership, by contrast, is not the role or position. It's activity. It is something you do. And that means that anyone, regardless of what role they occupy or regardless of their position in the organization, can take up leadership. So yes, the maintenance person can take up leadership in the organization. The receptionist can take up leadership in the organization. And certainly what we hope is that the person who occupies a position of authority or is called the leader, we hope that they are also taking up leadership. So a couple of key points about authority and leadership. Authority is given. When you take on a position in your organization as a leader or director, fill in the blanks in terms of the titles, you are given the authority as you're hired for that role or promoted into that role. You are given the authority to occupy that role, to be the director, to be the chief operating officer. As the authority, you are following a known path. This is what directors do. This is the job description for being the director. You are trying to preserve the things that work. That's part of your job. Keep the organization successful. And you may be focusing on maintaining the status quo, maintaining the things that are working. That's not always a bad thing. If it's working, there's nothing wrong with maintaining the status quo. But leadership is about those situations where things aren't working and helping to determine what needs to be discarded from the things that aren't working. Challenging the status quo, pushing the boundaries of your authority. Your job description may say your job is to make sure that X number of clients are served, X number of reports are filed, X number of dollars are raised. But in exercising leadership, you might have to push the boundaries of your job description. You may have to go beyond that to get the change that is needed. And in doing so, you may put yourself in a potentially dangerous situation. We like to say in this framework that leadership is dangerous activity, because when you push for change and you create a level of discomfort in people by trying to help bring about change, people might want to take you out. They might not be happy about that. They might feel like we're doing just fine the way we are. Nothing here needs to change. Why are you pushing for that change? So leadership does involve risk. And of course, there are tactics and strategies related to this. It doesn't mean you charge into the boardroom and like a bull to make change, although there might be situations where that's called for. But it doesn't have to be. Leadership doesn't have to be loud or externally bold, but it does need to push the boundaries. It does need to challenge the status quo. So as a result, leadership is not something that is given. It is always taken. Right? Authority is given. Leadership is taken. So let's think a little bit about people in history who have not had the authority role or position, but who have taken leadership. Someone who comes to my mind is Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was not the CEO of any particular company. She didn't even have the leadership role per se in the civil rights movement. But Rosa Parks challenged the status quo one day and said, I'm not giving up my seat on this bus. And in doing so, she absolutely challenged the status quo, and it was a dangerous move, right? It could have brought harm to Rosa Parks. But she determined that her purpose in doing that and the need for change was strong and important enough for her to take that risk, and she felt that the need for change was important enough for her to take that risk, and so she did. And that's an example, it's one example in our history of someone exercising leadership. Martin Luther King had the authority of being the known leader in the civil rights movement, but he also exercised leadership. So he had both the authority role and he exercised leadership by challenging the status quo, literally taking on the danger of disrupting the status quo. And as we know, he paid a dear price for that. Now, I'm not suggesting that as you try to make change in your organization, that you need to put your life in danger. But I do want you to be aware that sometimes in trying to bring about change, you will ruffle some feathers, and that could bring about challenges to your position. It could even challenge your employment. There are ways, and this is just an introduction to this framework, but there's much more information on tactics and strategies in how one goes about trying to affect change in an organization and doing your best to preserve yourself so that you don't get annihilated or taken out, and so that you can be effective in mobilizing change. So earlier I said that there are two types of challenges. There are technical challenges where there are known solutions that exist, and we pretty much know that if we apply that solution, we're going to get a certain result. And so it goes well with authority because these are tried, tested, and true solutions. You know, the usual, I have a headache, take 2 Tylenol. 9 out of 10 times that'll work. I have a scratchy sore throat. You do a test, you see if it's a bacterial infection, you administer antibiotics, 9 out of 10 times that'll clear it up. It doesn't mean that these are simple challenges, it simply means that the solution exists. But adaptive challenges are they're more complicated. When we're talking about an adaptive challenge, we are talking about making changes in people's values, their attitudes, and their practices. So you can see how that can be a lot more complicated. Adaptive challenges are about conflicts in values between stakeholders, right? What if the Board of Trustees says, you know, we value having a balanced budget, and having a balanced budget is definitely important. But what if the executive director is saying, I know that's important, but I also value quality services to clients, right? There could be a clash in those values. When we talk about adaptive challenges, we're talking about root issues, like what is the elephant in the room? What are some of those things that maybe aren't being spoken, but you know that these are tensions in the organization? There are no quick fixes, there's no easy answer, and you can't apply a technical solution. You can't say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We'll just have a potluck luncheon, and that'll solve all of the tensions that we have in the organization. But, you know, if we're honest with one another, that is what we tend to do in life, right? We get faced with a complicated situation, and we really work hard to try to address it. And sometimes the way we do that is by trying to apply a technical fix. So in this framework, we're asking you to think about, how do we go about bringing about adaptive solutions? So what we have to do then is diagnose the system, diagnose our organization. Who are the stakeholders in our organization? Right? Let's just think about some of them. The CEO, the chief operating officer, the finance director, the case managers, the staff, the clients. What are their values? And what are they loyal, or who are they loyal to? Maybe the CEO is loyal to the board. Maybe the staff is loyal to the prior CEO, right? So these are things that are going on under the surface. What would they stand to lose if the change you want to see actually were to happen, right? What would happen if you wanted to make your organization an anti-racist organization? What stakeholders in the system would stand to lose something if that actually happened? Who might lose power? Who might lose influence? Who might lose resources if that happened? So I want you to just take a moment, and I know we're running short on time, but just take a moment and think about a change you would like to create in your organization. And then I'd like you to just answer those questions. We may not have time to do that now, but I would like you to take that with you. Think about who are those key stakeholders in your organization. What do you think they value? What are their values based on your experience with them? What are their loyalties? What or whom are they loyal to? And what would happen? What would they lose if change were to happen? Now, an important point is that you are a stakeholder in the system as well. So don't forget to include yourself in that diagnosis. What are your values? Who are you loyal to? And what would happen if the change you want to see happens? What would you potentially lose? For example, maybe you're the person who always solves the crisis, and you're known as the crisis whisperer. But if the organization were to function more effectively, you might lose that status and that role, that unspoken role as the crisis whisperer, right? So everyone in the system has values and loyalties, and we want to examine what would they lose if the change actually happened. So earlier we were saying that you have to titrate the pressure, that you can't make change so rapidly that people freak out or so slowly that nothing happens. We like to use the analogy of a pressure cooker. If the heat is too high, the top of that pressure cooker is going to blow off. If the heat is too low, that dinner is not going to get cooked, right? And we're not going to eat. So we have to find just the right amount of heat to mobilize people to change. And the way we do that in this framework is we run experiments. We intervene by just testing little interventions to see what might work. And even if it doesn't work, we will learn more. We'll have more information for our diagnosis. So, for example, sometimes an experiment we can run is to find out where people stand on an issue in the organization. It could simply be having a brown bag lunch or a coffee clutch to get a sense of how people are feeling about the way things are going in the organization, so that you have some more information to inform future interventions. Sometimes an intervention is as simple as raising a question that surfaces a hidden issue, right? Something that hasn't been spoken in the organization. Everyone knows there's a particular elephant in the room, but nobody acknowledges it. Sometimes an intervention is simply raising the question as to whether that elephant is there. And that can lead to change in an organization simply because the issue is no longer hidden or unspoken, but it is surfaced. So a couple of qualities of adaptive leaders. One of the things adaptive leaders do is they link the organizational change that they're trying to make to the core values and dreams of the stakeholders involved. And I just want to share with you, I feel like a mistake I made when I was in a leadership role was to constantly explain to my team what the pressures were that I was under. The board wants this, ACS wants this. And I don't think they wanted to hear about the pressure I was under. They needed me to help lead them to where we were trying to go as an organization. So rather than linking the need for change to problems per se, link it to values, the dreams, the goals that stakeholders have. Adaptive leaders try to create an environment that embraces a diversity of views. You want to engage different views. You don't want groupthink. You don't want everyone, quote unquote, on board with what you believe. You really want a diversity of views because that diversity of views is where innovation and good ideas that can propel the organization forward can come from and can help benefit the organization. An adaptive leader understands that change can be painful and difficult for team members, so they anticipate that resistance or reluctant behavior from members of the team. And they understand that. And they understand that large-scale change is going to be a gradual process. It's going to take time, it's going to take persistence, and it's going to take a willingness to bear the pressure that comes with that. And so you're going to, as an adaptive leader, try to create an environment that can hold that tension and help people be able to deal with it. Adaptive leaders are also proactive, always looking for opportunities that are going to propel the organization forward. An adaptive leader admits when they make mistakes, going back to that role modeling the qualities you want in people. So admit when you make a mistake. Admit that, look, we've been going in this direction. I thought that was the way we needed to go, but it's not working and we're going to change course. Being open to experimentation and risk-taking, and encouraging innovation among team members. So that was a lot. It's a pretty deep framework, and it's very different from our traditional notions of leadership in which there's this one person who's supposed to have all of the answers. And in the world we live in, the agencies we operate in, the multiple stakeholders we have to deal with, there are no easy answers, and it's not possible for one person, no matter what you pay them, no matter what title you give them, it's not possible for one person to have all of the answers and all of the solutions. So we need to engage the collective intelligence and the collective wisdom of the members of our team in the organization. And that requires us looking at them in a different way and realizing that they may have value to bring to the organization. So I think it's a good time to pause here, and let me just ask, based on this brief introduction, what are you thinking? What concepts resonate with you? What concepts do you feel like don't make any sense at all to you?
Okay, we have some chatting in. This definitely changed my perception of leadership, says Kalisha. Meredith says, asks the question, are there specific strategies for leaders to take when there is a lot of uncertainty about the future and strategic planning is challenging? So when the future is uncertain and strategic planning is challenging, are there specific strategies for leaders to take?
Yeah. So, as I was sharing in terms of the what I was doing, there's a tendency, the more chaotic things are, is to almost kind of like double down on definitive approaches and answers. And so I think one of the key strategies is to, one, acknowledge the fact that we are in this period of uncertainty and unclear answers. Just acknowledging that for folks is really important, number one. Number two, to specifically state that no one person has all of the answers and that we are encouraging everyone's creative ideas. And to think about where is the forum in your organization for those creative ideas to be raised and to be contributed. To take an experimental approach, like, hey, what experiments can we run? What can we try to see if that might work? And how can we do that in a way that is safe enough for the organization, but what can we try? I think that's another thing that's really important to do.
Okay, great. We have a few more questions coming in. Someone had asked, but what if the authorities, quote unquote, believe they have all the answers and ignore the leaders that exist?
Yes, and that is so common. It is so common because most of us, when we assume leadership roles, we're trained into believing that we're supposed to have all of the answers. We believe that that's our job, that's why we're in that role, because we have all of the answers or we know where to find them, right? There isn't an acknowledgement that, some things there just aren't easy answers to, or there may not be an answer at all to it, and that we're going to have to work on creating solutions. So I think this is a good opportunity to diagnose the system, right? Look at for those people in authority who believe they have all of the answers. What are their values? What motivates them to operate the way they do? What are they loyal to? And what would they stand to lose if people who were not in authority positions began to exercise leadership? Begin understanding what's at stake for them. What would they be risking by allowing others to exercise leadership? 2, to recognize that they may not ask for your leadership, but you may feel that this is important enough that you need to contribute it anyway, and to think about, so how can I contribute my ideas and my leadership even though it's not being requested? Right? How can I help to create an environment in this organization where those ideas come up? So maybe it's taking the risk of raising a suggestion at a staff meeting, for example. Maybe it's writing a memo with, like, I have a proposal. I'd love to propose that we try this idea. And you may get shot down 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. Keep persisting. And I don't want to make this sound like this is like totally simple. It is not. There are I can't give you a definitive answer because it would depend so much on all of the details of your context. But I want you to think about what are some experiments you could run to advance ideas that you have.
Mm-hmm. Great. There are a lot of people sharing some comments, Dr. LaSalle Bryant. Mm-hmm. One is, I like the section presented about the values, loyalties, and loss if change happens. I like the idea of not linking change with problems, but the values of the agency. The comment about guiding the staff in the right direction rather than sharing with them all the pressures that fall on you as a leader. That comment stuck as I'm all about transparency, but sometimes it's possible to be too transparent.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. And, one of the things for those of us who are in authority roles, we do have a lot of pressure, and we often don't have much of a peer group to share that with. So it's important that we do have places and people, allies who we can turn to be able to share, like, I'm under this enormous pressure. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I don't know what to do next. But for staff, that it's okay to be transparent about some of the system pressures that exist, but to get them mobilized, we need to tap into something deeper. And that thing we need to tap into is their values, the things that motivate them to get up every day and come to this organization to work, right? Their values, their goals. Yeah.
Fantastic, because there is a question I was going to send to you. Are there strategies to promote creative thinking from staff? I get crickets whenever I ask for feedback, solutions, alternative approaches, etc.
Yeah, and I totally understand that. When I was using this framework in my organization, initially I did as well. And I think in part it is that, ironically, in our sector of human services, where we most need creativity and we most need to take chances and experiment, we don't tolerate the risk of failure. So if we were Facebook, Facebook tries things and fails all the time, but it's connected to their innovation because they learn from that failure. We have a harder time being able to accept that we do have to try some things and not all of them are going to work, right? We put pressure on getting it right rather than learning from the things that go wrong. So one approach with staff is to say, let's think about something we've been doing that hasn't been working so well, and what have we learned from that that could then lead us to some ideas. We may need to take a step back from the request for concrete ideas and kind of almost like reverse engineer the process and go back to the things that aren't working. So maybe encouraging, like, what things are we not doing as well as we would want to be doing them, or what things are not getting us the results that we hoped to get. Staff may also be afraid, like, do we really want their ideas? Will they somehow be penalized for sharing those ideas? Will their ideas be mocked as not, being a good idea? So we have to continue to do that. It's not something that happens in one meeting or two, but you make it part of the organizational culture, that call for critical analysis of how we're doing, that call for ideas and suggestions. And then they need to see that when they make those suggestions, they don't just get filed somewhere, but that we do attempt to take some action on them, even just to see if they will work. So we want to create an organizational culture that's more experimental and even playful in some way, like trying to we're gonna throw some spaghetti against the wall and see what might stick. We're going to take some time to think about it in that way.
Wonderful. This is so helpful. I'm getting a lot of feedback that this is a really wonderful presentation and really helpful. I think we have time just for one more question. Sometimes change is controlled by funding, staffing, or the external stakeholders. Yep. How do we minimize the discomfort of our team members when we can't control the rate of the change?
Yeah. And I think that is, I so appreciate that question because I feel like in our sector of human services, that is the story of our lives. That's the story of our work life. There's so many factors and forces that we don't have control over and yet that we're beholden to. And I think one part of it is acknowledging to the staff that there are things we don't have control over, but then really encouraging the places where we do, and how this organization chooses to respond and create and serve people in this sector within these constraints. That's something we do have control over. So let's get as creative as we can within those bounds, and let's also think about how we might be able to push, to apply a little pressure to those forces that we think are totally intractable. Because even those funders, those government entities, they are also moved by values, by loyalties. And if we understand what their values are and what their loyalties are, those are potential levers that we can push to influence change. So I think it's helpful to say, I know it looks like those things are immovable, and certainly they may be less flexible than what we can do here within the organization, but every system can be moved. We need to put the effort into figuring out, what are those levers? And the key to understanding those levers is try to identify those values, those loyalties, and what would they stand to lose if things changed. And that would help you shape what proposals you make to them about change, and it would help you move them or begin to move them somewhat. But helping staff to understand that while there are some things that aren't fully in our control, there are other arenas that are, and how creative we are in serving the people we care about, we have a lot of control over that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been so thought-provoking for so many of us. I just really appreciate you giving us your time and your energy and all of your wonderful knowledge and insight. I think
and I want to thank everyone for their work in this field and in this sector. And I feel like it's so important that we not lose hope and that we continue to pursue ways to bring about much needed change to the sector. So many people who will benefit from that.
Yeah, agreed. Wonderful. We're about out of time, but I just wanted to review. I showed the resources that Dr. LaSalle Bryant had shared. These are some of her resources from today's presentation if you're interested in learning more about adaptive leadership. And then these are some of our upcoming CTAC events. We have a lot going on in the rest of April and May. We have coming up the importance of parent involvement in child welfare on April 25th at 12 p.m. And then we have the Empowering Recovery and Resilience with Mindfulness on April 30th at 12 p.m. So we have, and as I mentioned, our May calendar is really full, so you can feel free to go onto our website, ctacny.org, and there's a calendar there that has all of our events that you can look at and sign up for those in the future. We do have some intensives happening around supervision as well as DBT that I hope that you've seen emails for and that are filling up quickly. So I just wanted to give a shout out to those. And I just wanted to thank you all. I agree with what Dr. LaSalle Bryant said in regards to all the hard work that you all are doing and how much we appreciate that. And again, thank you, Dr. LaSalle Bryant, for sharing with us all of your amazing information around adaptive leadership and how wonderful it is to really think differently about authority and leadership. And I just wanted to see if you had any final words for everyone.
Just thank you, and I encourage you to look at some of the readings. This is a really fascinating framework for people in our line of work.
Wonderful.
And thank you so much.
Great. Okay, everyone. Well, that concludes our webinar for today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and look forward to talking with you in the future. Bye-bye.
Bye.